from Blender. Thank you so much, Dalai.
So much, Pablo. Is the microphone on? Should I get on? Do you want
You,
to?
no, you do your thing. I'm going to sit down and enjoy.
Thanks so much for your talk. I'll watch it later. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for coming. It was hard for all of us. It was hard for me. I work at Blender nowadays as a product manager. Blender is an open source 3D software. Does anyone here do not know what Blender is? Don't be shy. Show of hands. All right. But, okay, some people, not many. Who here uses Blender for their work or their studies, their artistic expressions? Okay, some people in the audience. I won't really go over what is Blender, but we're going to be using Blender as a background to what we're going to be talking today, which is how do you handle design when you want to try to have an open, collaborative, all hands on board process? How do we keep a unified vision that's cohesive, that gives you a product, while also making sure we are not alienating the community? I'm going to be talking specifically about Blender, but I think a lot of these should apply to other open source projects or maybe even proprietary traditional software. I started my professional journey as an architect, is what I studied. I was actually already falling in love for set design. The turnaround is very quick. You get to design something, you get to see it. I was then familiar with the traditional vectorial applications from CorelDRAW, Adobe Illustrator, and of course Inkscape. You can see on top some of the projects I did while as an intern, but using Inkscape for those vectorial arts and you print is massive. I quickly moved from someone using those designing tools, 2D or 3D, to someone trying to create them. So as a developer, self-taught developer, I started to work with artists. I had great artists that I was collaborating with that for me was always inspiring to add more and more to what they could do with the tools they had at their disposal. And in that sense, open source was just a match made in heaven. And more recently, I transitioned towards product management, which sits in Blender in between product design and product as a whole. So I work a lot of communication, design, and now and then I get to work with the developers, and artists as well. So it's a bit of a combination of what I have been doing so far. So let's start with the basics. People might have different definitions of what is and what is not design. At Blender, we have this very specific understanding that design kind of sits between the traditional UI, UX, from the user interface, the flows, the usability, but also with the engineering. This is a definition I got from Tom Rosendahl, the chairman of the Blender Foundation, creator of Blender. And for me, as an architect, that resonated right away. As an architect, you are combining the experience from the clients or the public as a whole, the design that might be helping with the facade, and the furnitures, and the engineering requirements. So it is different than a designer that is trained in maybe industrial design or graphic design, but is a kind of a discipline that's going to be traversing different domains. What does it mean in practice? So when you do design at Blender, we are prone maybe to go a bit technical sometimes. So we do treat the data model, data representation as part of the design. This, for example, is when we were exploring view layers and collections back in 2017, 2016. And we had this understanding of what is the Blender file, the Blender database, and we wanted to show users a different way for them to explore and visualize their data. This is what we have in Blender since, this is so-called collections, but then we're trying to find a good metaphor, a good mental model. If you have a good metaphor that you can use to explain, people can use that to teach others to make sense of what you're building. It doesn't matter how abstract the underlying data structure and implementation is. So really try to think like high-level, big concept. Design can also be, again, in our case, but a high-level concept, even before talking about data and mental models. Like we have in Blender assets, so components, blocks, goes by different names in different places. An asset was defined by Tom as well, as an asset is a data block. So data blocks in Blender are the objects, materials, textures. A data block with meaning. The developers know, oh, meaning, we are talking about metadata, more information. But for the users, for the artists, that's, okay, I'm adding some meaning to a data block. That means I'm not creating an asset. I'm taking an existing data block and aggregating more data into it. So that gets to inform a lot of decisions also for development. We don't want to export a data block as an asset. What does that mean? How do you aggregate meaning to that? And then we can see that when talking to people about this, we reused the mental model we already established when it comes to the Blender database and where their data is, and try on top of that to build what is an asset. So you have the asset, those are your assets, how do you see them, whatever is the metadata. A part of creating design and collaborating in the design process is communication, right? Communication, communication, communication. We deploy a system in Blender, sometimes, not always, that I like to call A4 design. It's a ripoff from the Toyota A3 method. Toyota is known for revolutionizing how the collaboration happens in the ground floor of the floor plan, and how we can have in one piece of document everything you need to know about a certain project. So you can just go around rallying stakeholders, up management, people actually working on the problems you're trying to solve. And then you can, with this whole condensed information, convey everything you need. At Blender, we have a problem which is time scarcity, especially of stakeholders. It's very unique to Blender. No, I'm pretty sure it's a common problem. And oftentimes, we would create a whole elaborated presentation with 20 slides to get to specific high-level concept we thought of. But usually, you'd lose the stakeholders in the second slide, because there's something else that goes in a tangent. So we learned that this is also a pretty good exercise of being concise and syntax, to try to have this one page that you can just sit with anyone, you can post on Twitter, and say, okay, this is the big picture, bird's eye view, all the way to specifics. That's actually turned out to be really effective for us, again, for communication. But this kind of high-level design is usually sitting in what we call in the strategic parts of our projects. So when you're defining new projects, when you're defining new areas of Blender, of the market that you want Blender to explore. But Blender, we try to have things that are strategic, tactical, and operational. Without getting much into that, this is Army lingo that I think coaches kind of took over and used this for explaining how organizations can try to assign different roles and responsibilities. And although we do have it's still a centralized vision for Blender and Blender as a product, and the Blender Foundation and the Institute. Basically, the headquarters and the team we have in Amsterdam are the most, not the only, but the most responsible for that. We do have a whole organic flow of the rest of our organization where we have the more online presence. So we have the modules, which are the different parts of Blender that people can join, and they are more autonomous. So this is where tactical lives. So we have this big picture, but then we have these approved designs, but then how do you go about doing that? We also have what's called operational, which goes from bug fixing to basically helping with communication and small day-to-day things that are already, I would say, pre-approved, but you don't have a very hierarchical structure. Pre-approved just means if you want to start contributing to a project, this is the place with less friction. But across all of this structure, in the end of the day, we do have teams, basically, and we do have projects. Because it doesn't matter how we try to slice and organize the different parts of Blender, some of the problems we need to solve, they're pretty much like horizontal or vertical to the entire domain we try to portray. This is an example for the Geometry Nodes project. Some might know is the procedural modeling for Blender. At the time, we are transitioning from having single developers working in a project to try to have, let's say, all the capacities that you need to implement and be autonomous to solve that problem within the team structure. So we did have Jack, which is who started that project as a lead developer, other developers, Hans, at the time Sebastian. This was more a rotating seat. We had me like debuting as a product owner, product manager, was my first attempt at that. And then we had two people playing the role of designers. One is Pablo, who is here with us, Pablo Vasquez, helping, responsible for the testing and the whole UI and usability flow. And then we have a artist who is very special, like Simon Thoms. He's a great procedural artist, and we wanted him working closely with us, make sure that we had all the use cases grounded on the specific needs he had. And of course, stakeholders, and Irun, who was helping the, let's say, the how we do the thing we're trying to do, so the Scrum process. And although we were new at trying working with teams, this is back in 2020, we didn't have that many projects run by multiple people. This is still very aligned to something we always had at Blender, which is this product, Blender, the blender.org project at the core of what we do, and two different groups which are built to support this project as a whole. One is the Institute, where I'm employed, which is responsible for the development of the software and coordinate the online collaboration, but we do have like the center part. And we have the studio, who is in the headquarters. It's half and half. Half of the people working there are developers, half of them are artists, not designers doing usability and UI, but artists using Blender to making open movie projects. And they are required to use the latest Blender. It's a blessing and a curse. But they also believe on the mission of being involved in creating the tools they need themselves to make art. As an example, and this is from the 2022, we had Jacques and Hans, which I mentioned previously, coming from America, Germany, and America, respectively, because they work for the Institute, for the foundation, for the Institute, but work remotely. But we do have this old-fashioned headquarters, because even though we do have a lot of remote work, we also benefit a lot from having face-to-face. And then you see Simon and me basically on Simon's office, where he works, just discussing whatever we were discussing at the time. I think it was whatever it was. That still doesn't mean, or we still work with the community though. So working with a team in like self-contained sprints is very convenient, gets you far very fast. But we are not, Stone always like to say, we are not a software company. We are an open source project, first and foremost. And we do have this concept of stakeholders. So the same way I'll have Simon working with us, delivering us use cases and helping to testing the tools, we have someone like Daniel Bysted, great modeling artist, character designer, his portfolio, you've seen his work, I'm pretty sure. Someone who at some point wrote to us, hey, I would like to be involved. This is some of the projects I did. I would love to contribute to some of those files as a Creative Commons. So one of those non-pretentious files was what became the Blender 2.8 splash screen, and later the Blender 3.3 splash screen, I think. And we recently did the hair project in Blender. We changed how we do project, hair. And Daniel was the pivot stakeholder when it comes to what are the features we needed, which use cases we needed to convey. However, it's different to have people that you cannot rely in terms of office hours and you cannot tell them exactly what to do, than to have a design team on board. So we still embrace having the design as part of our team, and that allows us to work similar to how Penpot does, with a dual-track development. That's something from Jeff Patton, which means we do have the development with their sprints and their, let's say, to-do tasks, but then we also know that at some point in 1 week, maybe 2 weeks, we're going to need a design for that feature you might going to work on. And we don't want anyone to be blocked. We want people just to keep working. So we do have a separate, let's go, development track. In our case, it's in the same track. So the same board that has the development tickets also has the design tickets. And then we make sure they are time blocked. And we make sure that the core of these, the most have part of what you're building is done by the internal team. Just because otherwise, we cannot predict when things are going to be ready. As an example, this is the first use case we had for geometry nodes. And I think Andy mentioned that yesterday in the Penpot roadmap talk. At Blender, we're really good at saying no to use cases, no to basically, like, let's say, personas which you cannot afford to prioritize, to contemplate. So in this case, we knew that at first we wanted to be able to do set dressing. That means we're going to have like 20 nodes that would allow us to do better set dressing. No, that means you'd have maybe 5, maybe 10 nodes. And if you can do 1, 2 things good enough, and we can document this to people, again, communication, we are comfortable publishing these with Blender and having these already as a product, early to market, people can test and can iterate on it. Another example of using design in our process, this is a more traditional comparison, different variants. I love that having a whiteboard is usually my main approach for Penpot, by the way. Allow us to even go horizontal and vertical, so we can have variations on that end, but this maybe can have variations of variations. This is a thing from 2 weeks ago. We're using Penpot to compare different options to how to visualize panels and nodes. Interesting thing you can see here that we're doing is called wireframe mockups. And for the same project, but a different part of this, we call pixel perfect mockups. Because in this case here, we wanted people to understand exactly how the experience was going to be with the feature. On the wireframe case, we wanted to make sure people are not distracted by anything that we knew wasn't fully defined, like which buttons do we have, what is the padding, what is the color, no. So it's interesting also to leverage when to use, how to use design as a communication element as well, to know what you want to get from each part of the conversation. But the same way a project might require this big picture design when it comes to our top-bottom big project approach, we also encourage sometimes the teams themselves to come up with projects. But that means now the teams are responsible for big picture, big narrative of design. So this is also a recent example we did with Penpot as well, where because for geometry nodes, we wanted to do node-based brushes. And Blender had a very outdated brush management system. We said, you know what, let's improve the brush management. And then what is the story there, what is in the brush system, what is not, what is a draft. These are online, you can see the specific stories, but here we're using also the design as this narrative structure, like a bit of storytelling. But if you're honest, design is something that's present in everything we do throughout every little task we have to work on. So a couple of days ago, I think 2 weeks, 1 week, we were trying to address a different way to handle forward compatibility, meaning what happens if you are using the Blender 4, you save a file, and you open in an older Blender. You might know that if you should know that if you save your file, you might lose some data. And then, okay, let's throw a pop-up. And then I went downstairs to talk to Andy, again, the artist in the studio, and Andy, don't do a pop-up, please. Pop-ups, just ignore them. I cancel them. We also have a premise in Blender to never do like options, to avoid options like the plague. So it's not an option to where you can choose whether or not you want pop-ups. So we say, okay, let's do like a permanent warning. This is the whiteboard I have in front of my desk. So I could draft something there, bring people over, mention to Pablo. But still, we want to post this online, to talk to people, to be able to reiterate on it. And then once again, okay, quickly, let's take Penpot, have a screenshot of Blender on the background, and on top of this, let's add the UI elements. I think you can tell that something's changed from the original mockup to the pixel perfect mockup, which is part of what is gained by having the right tools for that part of the job. As you can see before, I only wanted the exclamation mark, and then, you know what? I think if you use the language we have for something else there. So it's really interesting for us to be able to have those tools as part of the everyday development process available for everyone. Very briefly, because we're getting to a closure here, the place where community can help the most is with feedback. So while for design we try to be cohesive and have a unified vision, and I don't really believe on design by committee much, even though when it comes to operational, there's a lot of design decisions that everyone are empowered to make. But if you really have a community of millions of users like Blender, we cannot really accommodate everyone to be sitting on the design table. It just doesn't scale. Penpot with 400,000 users. It falls into a similar scenario. So I mentioned like stakeholders, like power users, but we do have two different approaches for feedback, passive and active. Passive is very simple. We go to where the conversation is. We know that Twitter is not an open source forum. We know YouTube is not an open source video sharing program. But this is where the conversation is. So you know what? We go there, hashtag Blender, hashtag geometry nodes, B3D geometry nodes. See what people are talking about. And that helps us to highlight like potential use cases we haven't thought of. Recently, we developed what's called simulation nodes in Blender. You can do like particle simulation and a few crazy things. Before we worked on that, people were already posting workarounds to do this based on basically a hack. And it's beautiful because when it comes to product discovery, to try to find out what is that we could build and that's validated, people did this for you already. People already show that there is a need or potential use for this. So you can just skip the whole prototyping phase and go straight to building at scale. We also do active feedback with a very specific framework. So we have our forum, it's called Blender Talk, Dev Talk. And we have, for example, for simulation nodes. So one very specific feature, otherwise people can go off rails. We have this feature here. Here are some sample files, by the way, that shows good practices. Please start with them. Have you tried the feature? What have you done with this? So we have this policy of show your art. Don't only talk about it. We want to make sure we are listening to people that what they say is grounded on their specific needs and real needs. Tell me how we're using the tool, what you try to do, what you couldn't do because of there are some blocking problems, which workarounds you found, and what was a showstopper that you couldn't find a workaround. And if you had whatever new feature, what you could have done instead. We did this in two recent examples. And we also have done in the past, we reached out to specific artists. In this case, Arendelle, a fantastic procedural artist. Say, Arendelle, I've seen this tutorial for a different software, someone doing a curved wall, procedurally with gates. Can you try to do this with geometry nodes? And please document the process. And he went there, share the file, say, hey, I couldn't do this, this, and that, or this I couldn't do easily, but I did with this other approach. And it's not that you're going to take this literally as just feature requests, but that definitely helps us to have a very specific frame of user stories we can build on top of. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to design is that we do believe there's a difference between, start here. We do believe there is a difference when you're building something entirely new or when you're building something that millions of people use it already for established pipeline. So in product and design literature, there's this concept of MVP. And different people have different definitions of this. I love the definition by Henrik Knibert, which you're trying to build something interactively so that you get answers throughout the process. It's not about having final products that leads as steps in the assembly line, but it's about make sure you're getting something new every step of the way. However, there is fantastic concept which I think is very real, about interaction equity, which is how willing is your user to keep trying your product if the process gets frustrating over time. They go in a place, maybe this button didn't work, okay, they're still happy, it's a new exciting functionality. They try something else, now it didn't work as well. Don't worry, try tomorrow, and then tomorrow we have a new version, but then some of this pain never goes away. So we try to find this balance. For new products, new parts of Blender, we do try to be more, we can work with prototyping and try to be more innovative. But when it comes to existing features, I'm really wary about having people trying it before we have a more polished experience. So we do oftentimes would go over one of new functionality and just do, I call it a polished pass. Recently for the asset shelf, it's something that our animators are going to have to use every day, replacing what they do already. I feel a bit Blender specific. But while the code is being reviewed, we are working on the polishing. So you're not polishing before it gets reviewed because it can be done in parallel. We don't want people to not use until it's polished. But actually I do. In this case, I do want the animators to first try that when it's already feeling closer to the final experience. It's risky. You spend more time that maybe could have done a prototype, but animators are very specific stakeholders. A different example is the snap polishing. So we did a new snap base in Blender recently. But this is a new feature within snapping. We just committed to main, to where the Blender code is, so people can try already. But then very quickly also, okay, let's go over a polishing stage where people can have a better experience from that. So I finished the main part of my talk. I can open for questions, but I do have a few bonus slides that is showing a little bit how we use Penpot, which I'd love to go through, and then if we have time, we still open for questions. I think it's going to be, it's good. So we use Penpot in Blender for everything that when it comes to design, or we try to at least. From a very traditional design work, at some point we wanted to have some flyers for people working at Blender. We do have openings some development positions are open. We do also look for by the way, front-end and back-end developer. If you know people, send them our way. We do use Penpot for basically communication pieces to polish a design more than we need for our own design documents, but whenever something goes to the final blog that artists might read, it's so nice to have these nice, good-looking pieces of design. This is an interesting example of using different tools for the job. So that started as a whiteboard, old-fashioned whiteboard drawing, how we wanted to show simulation nodes in a blog post. Do I have a laser? I do have a laser. No, yeah, I do have a laser. Basically, you have the whiteboard, and on its side, we have how it looks in Blender. But then I wanted to show in a more stylized way to go with the blog post. So I did this basic polygon convex hull, and I wanted to do a little bit chamfer, and Penpot doesn't have that, and it's fine. But Inkscape has it. So I took a screenshot, went to Inkscape. It's so nice. Just picked there the chamfer, copied the SVG, went back to Penpot. I do miss a little bit being able to bring from Penpot to Inkscape with copy and paste. I don't know in which part of the equation it's missing, but it would be fantastic to have. With Blender as well, I presume, to be able to paste SVJs. Also, a recent example, we had two different colors to show baked sequences in our timeline. One if the bake was valid, which was the high saturated pink. Another one if the bake was invalid. But that was a bit hard for people to tell apart. We had a low contrast. So you know what, let's try to have strips. And then we went to Penpot, Pablo and I, to try to find, okay, which angle do you want? What's the spacing that we want? Do we want it going right or left? We end up going that way because we wanted to show that, hey, that's invalid, that's a problem. So instead of showing, hey, that's a progress. And it's, again, there are times that you want scrappy back of the napkin drawings. There are times you want a final refined UI mockups. And then having this digital is just so powerful. Finally, because a lot of the use cases I mentioned, they are just replacing a desktop application, which is fine. But we often would also open the whiteboard and have this is Hans, by the way, have the developers also open the whiteboard on their end, and then each one can navigate independently. You can point to things into the board. I have a slide here just because Pablo insisted us to mention feature requests. I don't do feature requests for open source projects. No one should do that. I do have a few pain points which I talked to the team already. I won't go over them, but I like to have it here so I can look back in 1 year, 2 years, like, oh, this is all done already. It's fantastic. Finally, because I wanted to understand the open part of Penpot, I was already in love with the product, but how do you handle community? How do you handle contributions? So I had a bug reported in the past, but I reported a new one, which I found, which was I wanted to distribute some elements equally in my file. And in Blender, we have a lot of padding included in our icons and everything else. So, very reasonable expectation to have, if you ask me. And I got a reply very quickly. Thanks a lot. However, it was a classic reply that, if you're not really sorry, come on. Jokes aside, I talked to Andy, I think. I said, OK, I got the point. I replied again, making my case again. I actually created an account on Figma for the first time, just to see how they handle that. Dangerous precedents. And I did something which is very passive-aggressive, which is, you know what? I think it's a problem. I'm going to try to fix that. The code, as some people mentioned here, is a little bit, doesn't follow a very standard language. They used a Lisp-based language, which is a Clojure.js, and oh boy, that looks so complicated. I couldn't make heads or tail of that. Luckily, I have like a 1-hour crash course on YouTube. I'm willing to go all the way to the end. And then I managed to have 2 patches sent for review. It got reviewed. I don't think it's in published, but it's in the development track. So I'd like to really thank Penpot for the care for the community, going over the bug tracking, fixing bugs, reviewing bug fixes and new features. So that's a big thank you for Penpot. And do we have time? And thank you very much. As I said, no questions because I think it would be nice.
The whole day.